The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that feels heavy, like the air itself is holding its breath. Every eye was fixed on the judge, a stern figure whose expression gave nothing away. On one side of the room stood two white police officers, their uniforms crisp, their faces calm, almost smug. They had been accused of misconduct, but their confidence suggested they believed the system was on their side. And why wouldn't they? The system often was. On the other side of the room sat a black man, dressed in a simple suit, his face unreadable. He had been the victim of their alleged abuse, but in this moment, he looked more like an observer than a participant. The judge had just ruled in favor of the officers, dismissing the case with a wave of his hand. It seemed like just another day in a system where power and privilege often tipped the scales. But then, something unexpected happened. The black man stood up, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "Your Honor," he said, his tone calm but firm, "before we conclude, there's something you should know." The room froze. What could he possibly say to change the outcome? The judge raised an eyebrow, clearly annoyed by the interruption. "And what might that be?" he asked, his voice dripping with skepticism. The man reached into his pocket and pulled out a small badge, holding it up for everyone to see. "I'm a U.S. attorney," he said, his words landing like a thunderclap. The officers' faces went pale. The judge's expression shifted from annoyance to shock. The entire dynamic of the room changed in an instant. Who was this man, and why had he kept his identity hidden until now? What did this mean for the case, for the officers, for the system itself? The tension was palpable, the stakes higher than anyone had anticipated. And just when it seemed like the truth might finally come to light, the judge called for a recess, leaving everyone in suspense. What would happen next? The story was far from over, and the twists were just beginning as the courtroom emptied. Whispers filled the air. The officers exchanged nervous glances, their confidence shaken. The U.S. attorney remained seated, his face still unreadable, but there was a quiet determination in his eyes. He had played his hand, but the game was far from finished. Outside the courtroom, the media was already buzzing with the news. A black man, a victim of police misconduct, had turned the tables in the most dramatic way possible. But this wasn't just about one case. It was about a system that had failed too many people for too long. It was about justice, power, and the lengths some would go to protect their own. The U.S. attorney had a story to tell, and it was one that would challenge everything people thought they knew about the law, about race, and about the fight for equality. But as the recess dragged on, one question lingered in everyone's mind. What would happen when the gavel came down again? The answer would change lives, but for now, all anyone could do was wait. The tension was unbearable, the stakes unimaginable. And the truth? It was closer than anyone realized, but it would come at a cost. The story was just beginning, and no one was ready for what would happen next. The recess felt like an eternity. The U.S. attorney, whose name was Marcus Johnson, sat quietly at the plaintiff's table, his hands folded neatly in front of him. His calm demeanor was a stark contrast to the storm brewing around him. He had been through this before, not as a victim, but as a prosecutor. He knew how the system worked, how it could bend and twist to protect its own. But this time it was personal. This time, he wasn't just fighting for justice. He was fighting for himself. The officers, now huddled in a corner with their lawyer, were whispering furiously. Their confidence had evaporated, replaced by a nervous energy that made them fidget and glance over their shoulders. They had thought this was just another routine case, another win in a long line of victories. But Marcus had changed the game, and they weren't ready for it. Marcus's mind drifted back to the night that had brought him here. It had started like any other evening. He was driving home after a long day at work, his mind still buzzing with the details of a high-profile case he was prosecuting. He had stopped at a red light when the flashing lights of a police cruiser appeared behind him. He hadn't been speeding, hadn't broken any laws, but he knew the drill. He kept his hands on the wheel, his movements slow and deliberate. The officers approached his car, their flashlights blinding him. He identified himself, showed his license and registration, but something about their tone set off alarm bells. They asked him to step out of the car, and when he questioned why, things escalated quickly. Before he knew it, He was on the ground, handcuffed, his face pressed against the asphalt. He tried to explain who he was, but they didn't listen. They didn't care. All they saw was a black man in a nice car, and that was enough for them to assume the worst. The incident had left him shaken, not just because of the physical confrontation, but because of what it represented. Marcus had spent his career fighting for justice, believing in the system, believing that the law could be a force for good. But that night, he had seen the other side of it. The side that didn't care about truth or fairness. The side that saw people like him as threats, no matter who they were or what they had accomplished. It was a wake-up call, one that had pushed him to take a stand in a way he never had before. He had filed a complaint, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been in his position. He wanted to expose the cracks in the system, to hold those in power accountable. But he also knew it wouldn't be easy. The officers had denied everything, and their department had closed ranks around them. The case had been dismissed once already, but Marcus wasn't ready to give up. He had decided to represent himself, to fight his own battle, and to do it in a way that would force the system to confront its own biases. As the recess dragged on, the tension in the courtroom grew. The judge, a seasoned veteran known for his no-nonsense approach, had retreated to his chambers, leaving everyone to wonder what he was thinking. Was he reconsidering his decision? Was he angry at being blindsided by Marcus's revelation? Or was he simply buying time to figure out how to handle the situation without causing a scandal? Marcus didn't know, but he could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. This wasn't just about his case anymore. It was about something bigger, something that could have far-reaching consequences for the legal system, for law enforcement, and for the country as a whole. Outside the courtroom, the media had descended like vultures, their cameras and microphones ready to capture every detail. The story was already trending online, with hashtags like #JusticeForMarcus and #YouDadest, attorney fights back gaining traction. People were taking sides, their opinions shaped by their own experiences and biases. Some saw Marcus as a hero, a man willing to stand up to a broken system. Others saw him as a troublemaker, someone who was using his position to stir up controversy. The debate was heated, and it was only going to get more intense as the case unfolded. Back inside the courtroom, Marcus's thoughts turned to his family. His wife, Angela, had been his rock through all of this. She had encouraged him to fight, even when it seemed like the odds were stacked against them. His 2 kids, still too young to fully understand what was happening, had been his motivation to keep going. He wanted to create a better world for them, a world where they wouldn't have to face the same injustices he had. But he also knew that the road ahead would be difficult. The system didn't change easily, and those who challenged it often paid a price. Marcus was prepared for that, but it didn't make the weight of it any lighter. The officers, meanwhile, were growing more agitated by the minute. Their lawyer, a seasoned defense attorney with a reputation for winning tough cases, was trying to reassure them, but even he seemed uneasy. This wasn't just another case anymore. It was a potential career ender, a scandal that could tarnish their reputations and cost them their jobs. They had thought they were untouchable, but Marcus had shattered that illusion. Now, they were scrambling to figure out their next move, but the options were limited. They could try to settle, but Marcus had made it clear that he wasn't interested in a settlement. He wanted the truth to come out, no matter how ugly it was. As the minutes ticked by, the tension in the room became almost unbearable. The spectators, a mix of curious onlookers and journalists, were whispering among themselves, speculating about what would happen next. The bailiff stood by the door, his expression neutral, but his eyes darting around the room as if he, too, was feeling the pressure. Even the court reporter, usually a picture of professionalism, seemed on edge, her fingers hovering over the keyboard as if expecting something explosive to happen at any moment. Finally, the door to the judge's chambers opened, and everyone turned to watch as he walked back to the bench. His face was unreadable, but there was a new intensity in his eyes, as if he had made a decision that would change everything. He sat down, adjusted his robe, and looked out over the courtroom. "Counselors," he said, his voice calm but firm, "we will proceed." The room held its breath. What did that mean? Would the case be reopened? Would the officers face new charges? Or would the judge find a way to shut it down, to protect the system at all costs? Marcus straightened in his seat, his heart pounding. This was it, the moment of truth. But as the judge began to speak, it became clear that the story was far from over. The twists and turns were just beginning, and no one, not Marcus, not the officers, not even the judge, knew how it would end. The tension was palpable, the stakes higher than ever. And the fight for justice? It was just getting started. The judge's voice cut through the heavy silence like a blade. Given the new information presented, this court will reconsider the motion to dismiss, he said, his tone measured but firm. A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom, but a sharp look from the judge silenced them instantly. Marcus felt a flicker of hope, but he knew better than to let his guard down. This wasn't over, not even close. The officer's lawyer, a man named Greg Harper, stood up quickly, his face flushed. "Your Honor, I must object," he said, his voice tight with frustration. "This is highly irregular. The plaintiff's identity has no bearing on the facts of the case." The judge raised a hand, cutting him off. "Counselor, sit down. This court will hear the arguments. Mr. Johnson, you may proceed." Marcus stood, his heart pounding but his voice steady. He began to lay out his case, methodically and deliberately, as if he were back in his office preparing for trial. He recounted the events of that night, the unnecessary aggression, the way the officers had ignored his attempts to explain who he was. He spoke about the bruises on his wrists from the handcuffs, the humiliation of being treated like a criminal when he had done nothing wrong. But he didn't stop there. He brought up statistics about police misconduct, about the disproportionate targeting of black men, about the countless cases that never made it to court because the victims didn't have the resources or the platform to fight back. His words were powerful, his delivery calm but impassioned. The courtroom was spellbound, hanging on every word. But Greg Harper wasn't about to let Marcus have the last word. When it was his turn to speak, he launched into a defense of the officers, painting them as hardworking public servants who had been put in a difficult position. "Your Honor, my clients were simply doing their jobs," he said, his voice dripping with sincerity. "They had reason to believe Mr. Johnson was a threat. They acted in good faith, and they should not be punished for that." He went on to argue that Marcus's status as a U.S. attorney was irrelevant, that it didn't change the facts of the case. But Marcus could see the cracks in his argument, the way his words lacked conviction. The officers, sitting stiffly beside him, looked uneasy, their confidence clearly shaken. As the arguments continued, the tension in the room grew thicker. The judge listened intently, his expression unreadable, but Marcus could tell he was weighing every word carefully. This wasn't just about one case anymore. It was about accountability, about the balance of power, about the very principles the legal system was built on. Marcus knew that whatever decision the judge made, it would have far-reaching implications. But he also knew that the fight didn't end here. Even if the judge ruled in his favor, there would be appeals, media scrutiny, and public backlash. The officers' department had already begun circling the wagons, releasing statements defending their actions and questioning Marcus's motives. The battle was just beginning, and it was going to be a long and grueling one. Outside the courtroom, the story was spreading like wildfire. News outlets were picking it up, and social media was ablaze with opinions and hot takes. Some people praised Marcus for standing up to systemic injustice, while others accused him of using his position to play the victim. The debate was polarizing, and it was only getting more heated as more details emerged. Marcus's phone had been buzzing nonstop with messages from colleagues, friends, and even strangers offering support or criticism. He tried to ignore it, to stay focused on the case, but it was hard. The weight of it all was starting to wear on him. Meanwhile, the officers were facing their own struggles. The media attention had turned their lives upside down, and they were feeling the pressure. One of them, Officer Dan Harris, had always prided himself on being a good cop, someone who followed the rules and did his job with integrity. But now, he was being painted as the villain, and it was eating away at him. He had joined the force to make a difference, to protect and serve, but this case had shaken his faith in the system. His partner, Officer Mike Reynolds, was more defensive, convinced that they were being unfairly targeted. "We didn't do anything wrong," he kept saying. But even he was starting to wonder if they had crossed a line. As the day wore on, the courtroom drama continued to unfold. Witnesses were called, evidence was presented, and the arguments grew more intense. Marcus's legal training gave him an edge, but he was up against a seasoned defense attorney who knew all the tricks of the trade. The back and forth was exhausting, and by the time the judge called for another recess, everyone in the room was on edge. The tension was palpable, the stakes higher than ever. But as Marcus sat there, surrounded by the chaos, he couldn't help but think about the bigger picture. This wasn't just about him, or the officers, or even this case. It was about a system that had failed too many people for too long. It was about justice and what it really meant in a world where power and privilege often dictated the outcome. As the recess dragged on, Marcus found himself thinking about his family again. His wife, Angela, had been his rock through all of this, but he could see the toll it was taking on her. She had always believed in him, supported him, but this was different. This was personal, and it was putting a strain on their relationship. His kids, too young to fully understand what was happening, could sense the tension in the house. Marcus hated that they had to go through this, but he also knew that he couldn't back down. He had to see this through, no matter how hard it got. The officers, meanwhile, were huddled with their lawyer, trying to figure out their next move. They knew they were in a tough spot, but they weren't ready to give up. They had too much to lose: their careers, their reputations, their freedom. But as they sat there, arguing over strategy, they couldn't shake the feeling that the ground was shifting beneath them. The system they had always relied on to protect them was starting to feel like a house of cards, and they were one wrong move away from bringing it all crashing down. When the judge finally returned to the bench, the room fell silent once again. He looked out over the courtroom, his expression grave. "This court has heard the arguments," he said, his voice steady but heavy with the weight of the decision he was about to make. "But before I rule, there is one more matter to address." He paused, letting his words sink in. Marcus felt his heart skip a beat. What now? The tension in the room was unbearable, the suspense almost too much to take. The judge leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Marcus. "Mr. Johnson," he said, "there is a question this court needs answered. Why did you wait until now to reveal your identity?" The room held its breath. Marcus hesitated, his mind racing. How would he answer? What would he say? The stakes had never been higher, and the truth, whatever it was about to come out. But as Marcus opened his mouth to speak, the judge raised his hand. "We'll reconvene tomorrow," he said. "Court is adjourned." And just like that, the moment was over, leaving everyone in the room and everyone watching on the edge of their seats. The story was far from over, and the twists and turns were just getting started.